My name is Emily, and I'm a nurse. I've been taking care of sick people for most of my life. I'm 34 years old, and I've seen a lot of things in my job. I've helped people when they're hurting, when they're getting better, and sometimes when they're saying goodbye. You learn so much as a nurse, way more than any book can teach you. You learn to listen with more than just your ears. I can tell when someone is scared just by how they hold my hand. I can see hope in someone's eyes, even when they don't say a word. I thought I had seen it all, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for the time I spent with him. Everyone knows Pope Francis from TV. The man in fancy robes speaking to huge crowds with a voice that travels across the world. But the man I met wasn't like that at all. His body was weak, yes, but there was something about his spirit that was different, powerful in a way I'd never felt before. That morning started like many others. I walked into his room with the quiet steps all nurses learn to use around sick people. But that hallway felt super long, like each step took forever without me even noticing. I wasn't really nervous, but I felt like I was being watched, not by people but by something else. Like the walls themselves knew something important was about to happen between us. I had no idea that this talk would change how I see life, death, and what it means to believe in something. The hospital room was plain and simple on purpose. Nothing special about it. Nothing that would give away where it was or why it mattered. But even though it was simple, the air felt thick. Not just with hospital smells, but with something heavy. Like something special had been growing there quietly, waiting for someone to notice. He was already awake when I came in, sitting up a little in bed. He wasn't looking at me, but at the tiny bit of window high on the wall, where morning light was sneaking in. His face looked thinner than yesterday, so pale you could almost see through it, but his eyes were sharp, like his body might be giving up, but his mind was more awake than ever. He didn't say hello like usual. No smile, no blessing, just that look. Slowly turning from the window to me, eyes locking on mine like he was reading something deep inside me. It made me pause. I'm used to being the calm one, the one who makes others feel better. But right then, I felt more like a student, about to learn something big. I came closer quietly, not wanting to mess up whatever peaceful moment he'd found, and reached for his chart just out of habit. That's when he spoke. "Sit," he said, and even though his voice was weak, it cut through the room like it was the most important word in the world. I froze for a second, surprised. Then slowly, I sat down in the chair beside his bed, holding the folder tighter than I needed to. He turned his head slightly, looking straight into my eyes. "I don't want prayers. I want truth." It shocked me. His words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, like they didn't just fill the space but carved themselves into it. I remember blinking, not sure what to say. I had said so many prayers over the years, for my patients, for strength, for patience, but this wasn't someone asking for comfort. He was demanding honesty, real honesty, the kind that makes your heart beat faster, the kind that doesn't come with easy words. "I'm just a nurse," I said quietly, not sure what truth I could possibly offer someone who had spent his whole life studying holy books and leading millions of people. But he shook his head gently, a tiny movement, but full of meaning. "That's exactly why I'm asking you," he said. "Not the church leaders, not the experts. You." I sat there silently, not knowing what to do with this invitation. Part of me wanted to go back to the safety of my normal routine, check vitals, adjust medication, make small talk. But another part, the deeper part, knew that this moment was special and I shouldn't waste it. He didn't want fancy words about heaven. He didn't want rituals. He wanted something real, something honest. And even though I didn't know much, I understood that the first thing he told me wasn't about heaven or rules or right and wrong. It was a story, a memory from long before he ever became Pope. He didn't give details, no names or places, but it was about a day he failed someone. Not in a big tragic way, but in a quiet one. A moment where someone came to him looking for love and kindness, and instead of being compassionate, he stuck to the rules. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid of what people would think. Afraid of betraying the church. Afraid of stepping outside the line." He paused then, looking past me. "But fear," he added, "is not holy, and I let it lead me." That hit something inside me. This man, loved by millions, was confessing not to God, but to a nurse. To a woman sitting by his side with no special title, no training in religion, just a heart willing to listen. That's when I realized this wasn't about him getting something off his chest. It was about offering something to me. A gift, wrapped in honesty. What came next wasn't a lecture. It wasn't preaching. It was something else completely. Something I've never really had words for, though I've tried many times. He started talking about the weight of what people expect. How everyone thinks being holy means being sure about everything, but that really, it's mostly silence. Long stretches of silence. Waiting for God, not hearing answers, doubting yourself, wrestling in the dark, and still choosing to love anyway. That, he said, is the holiest kind of faith. I remember feeling my chest tighten because it made sense in a way nothing else ever had. I had never heard anyone, especially not someone like him, admit that doubt and faith could exist together. Not as enemies, but as friends. And then came the moment that still echoes in my dreams. He turned to me again, eyes sharp, almost glowing, despite how weak his body was. "Do you know what most people never realize about faith?" he asked. I didn't answer. I don't think I could have. I just shook my head slightly. He leaned in as close as his tired body allowed and whispered, "It's not something you find. It's something that finds you, usually in the dark." I sat there holding those words in my hands, like they were made of glass. They felt too important to speak out loud, too special to question. I wanted to ask more, but I knew that was enough for now. Something had started. Something neither of us could name yet, but I felt it. And what he said next still stays with me. He didn't speak again right away. For a long time, we just sat there, the quiet settling back around us like a warm blanket. I could hear the soft hum of something mechanical outside the door, a cart being wheeled down the hallway, another nurse talking far away. But inside that room, it was like the world had slowed down, folded in on itself. His breathing was slow, not deep but steady, and I could sense he was waiting, not for strength, but for the right moment. He didn't waste words. That much I had learned. When he spoke, it was like each word had been tested by fire before he let it out. "You know," he began again, voice quieter now, "people think faith is about being certain, about having answers. But I think real faith is what's left when the answers don't come." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. There was nothing in me that wanted to argue or correct him. Instead, I just listened. Something deeper than my nurse training was guiding me. Now, I had read about faith, of course. I'd heard the stories. I'd grown up sitting in church pews, surrounded by songs and Bible verses, and the quiet nods of people who all seemed to know what they believed. But when I really thought about it, I couldn't remember ever hearing someone describe faith like this. Not as rules, not as a list of things to believe, but as a living thing, a breathing, breaking, enduring thing. He spoke slowly, like he was turning over stones inside himself, showing me the dirt underneath. "There was a time," he said, "when I stopped praying, not because I was angry. I just couldn't anymore." He paused, and I noticed his fingers pressing lightly into the blanket. A little tension there. I had gone too long hearing silence. I begged God for answers, for signs, for help, and what I got in return was nothing, just more silence. At first, I thought I had done something wrong. Maybe I didn't have enough faith. Maybe I was being punished. But over time, I began to understand something that no sermon had ever taught me. I leaned in slightly, not wanting to miss a word. He wasn't just remembering. He was revealing something raw and special. Faith, he said, isn't about hearing God. It's about trusting He's still there when you don't. The words dropped like stones into water, rippling out inside me. I had heard people talk about trusting God before, but always with the idea that you'd get something back. Trust and He will give you what you ask for. Trust and He will answer. But what he was saying now turned all of that upside down. Trust without answers. Trust without even the promise of them. I used to think faith was built in the light, he went on, in churches and community and joy. And maybe part of it is, but the kind that really matters, the kind that changes you, that begins when the lights go out, when you're alone, when there's no one watching, when the silence stretches so long you start to wonder if you ever heard anything at all to begin with. My throat got tight. I thought of the nights I had spent awake in my tiny apartment, praying into the dark and hearing nothing back. I thought of patients I'd sat with as they cried or died or lost hope, and all the times I had wanted to say something, anything, but had nothing to offer but just being there. Was that faith? Had I been missing it all along because it didn't look like the shiny version I'd been taught? He turned his head slightly to look at me. Eyes narrowed, not judging me, but with intensity. "You want to know what I think God values most?" he asked. I didn't answer. A heart that stays open when it has every reason to shut. He didn't say it like he was quoting from a book. He said it like someone who had walked through fire and had come out holding the truth in his hands. He said it like someone who had seen his own faith cracked, broken, crushed to dust, and still chose to believe. I used to think believing meant being certain, I admitted softly, surprising myself. But now I don't know. He smiled faintly, and there was warmth in it. Not the smile of a man who knew more than me, but of someone who had once been exactly where I was now. Belief, he said, isn't certainty. It's willingness. The willingness to hope when you have every reason not to. The willingness to stay soft when the world wants you to get hard. The willingness to say yes to something you can't prove, can't explain, and sometimes can't even feel. That shook something loose inside me. Not just because of what he said, but because of how much it made sense in a way I'd never been allowed to think about. We're taught to think of belief as agreeing with a list of facts, but what he was describing was something else. Something much messier, much more human, and much more beautiful. I've seen people with perfect religion knowledge, he continued, and hearts full of pride. And I've seen people with no words for God, no rules, no answers, yet with more love than 1,000 sermons. Tell me which of those truly believes. I didn't answer. I couldn't because I realized I had never asked myself that question before. Maybe belief wasn't about how well you could repeat the right words, but about how you treated someone who couldn't do anything for you. Maybe it wasn't about defending what you believe, but living it quietly, gently, honestly. He looked tired after that, and I knew not to push. But just before I stood up to check his IV, he added one more thing, voice even softer than before. Real faith doesn't make you louder. It makes you quieter. It teaches you to listen, especially when all you want to do is speak. I stood there for a moment, his words settling into me like roots. I had walked into that room thinking I knew what faith was, thinking I understood what it meant to believe. But now I wasn't so sure. And for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that because maybe faith wasn't supposed to be a thing you held. Maybe it was a thing that held you. And somewhere deep down in that quiet, where all the old certainties had started to disappear, I felt something stir, a flicker of something new, not yet named, but it was there, alive, waiting. Whatever it was, it felt like the beginning of something real. He hadn't said much the next morning. I had arrived early, earlier than usual, not sure why exactly, just a feeling I couldn't shake. The hallway had been silent, the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something, like the moment before rain, or before someone tells you something important. I opened the door gently, and found him already awake, his eyes wide open, but not really alert. More like he was floating somewhere between sleep and being awake, between here and somewhere else. The light was soft, just barely starting to touch the walls, and he looked like he was made out of shadow and gold. I almost didn't want to speak, afraid I'd break whatever was holding him there. But he turned to me slowly, and without saying hello, said, "Tell me what you think prayer is." The question caught me by surprise. It wasn't a casual question. Not with him. Not now. It wasn't the kind of question you can just answer quickly. He was watching me, waiting, like my answer would really matter. I hesitated before replying. "It's conversation," I said finally. "Talking to God. Asking, thanking, listening." He smiled faintly. "That's what I used to say too." I sat down beside his bed, feeling that he had already begun another one of those quiet lessons. The kind that didn't feel like teaching until it reached the center of you and changed something forever. He looked past me toward nothing in particular, like he was trying to remember something buried deep, or maybe trying to find the right words. "Prayer," he said, "has become a performance." I said nothing. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight behind those words. His disappointment, his sadness, maybe even his guilt. "We recite," he continued. "We beg. We repeat. Sometimes we shout. Sometimes we whisper. And yet so often it feels like noise. Holy noise maybe, but noise all the same." He turned his eyes back to me. "But when you strip it all away, the ritual, the rules, the fancy words, what's left?" He paused long enough for the silence to begin answering the question itself. "When there's no crowd, no candles, no memorized lines, when there's only you and the dark, what then?" I didn't know. I didn't have an answer that felt good enough. But he wasn't really asking for an answer. He was preparing me for something. I could feel it. "There's a prayer I say," he whispered. "Only when I'm completely alone. Never in church. Never during formal services. Only when I'm sure no one is listening but him. Not even the saints. Just him and me." He closed his eyes then, and I thought maybe that was the end of it, that he was falling asleep. But after a moment, he opened them again and looked at me with such strong intensity, I felt like he could see every lie I'd ever told myself. "It's not a prayer I was taught," he said. "It's not one you'll find in any book. It came to me one night when I was young, angry, confused, and I've said it ever since. I wanted to ask what it was, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I sat still, heart racing, mouth dry, knowing something special was being handed to me, piece by fragile piece." He cleared his throat softly, and then barely louder than a breath, he began, "God, I don't know who you are today, and I don't know if you know me anymore. But if you're listening, I'm still here. I still want to be good. Even when I'm tired, even when I'm lost, even when you feel 1,000 miles away, help me to keep loving. Help me to keep trying. And if you can't speak, at least stay. Just stay." That was it. No grand ending, no amen, just silence, thick and holy. I didn't even realize I was crying until I felt the tears on my hands. It wasn't the kind of prayer I had ever heard before. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't wrapped in Bible verses or fancy religious words. It wasn't confident. It was human. So incredibly human. Raw, desperate, honest in the way we almost never let ourselves be, especially not when talking to God. He didn't look at me when he finished. He kept looking at the ceiling, and his lips didn't move again for several minutes. It was like he had stepped out of the moment completely, vanished into something unseen. I didn't speak either. I didn't want to ruin the silence that followed that prayer. It wasn't the kind of silence you break. It was the kind you carry. When he finally turned back to me, he looked older than he had just minutes before. Not in a way that made him seem weak, but in a way that made him look ancient, like someone who had been carrying secrets too big for one lifetime. "I've never said that prayer aloud to anyone," he said, "and I never meant to, but I think maybe it's time." There was a pause, the kind of pause that sits on the edge of a big decision. Then he added with a rougher voice, "Promise me something." I nodded. "Don't repeat it. Not until you know someone needs it." I looked at him, not sure how I would know, but he saw the question in my eyes and gave the smallest smile. "You'll know." I carried that prayer with me for days after. Weeks. It followed me, not in a scary way, but in the way something pure stays with you, because it knows you're not ready to let go of it. I wrote it down once, then tore up the paper. I whispered it into my pillow at night when I couldn't sleep. I felt it inside me beating like a second heart, waiting. And now I know someone needs it. He made me promise never to repeat it until now. It was raining the day he asked me to bring him a Bible. Not the fancy gold-covered ceremonial kind that sits on church altars. Just a small, well-used one. Soft cover. The kind you might put in a coat pocket. I had one in my bag. One I carried more out of habit than anything else. Its pages were dog-eared. Its spine cracked from years of being carried around, but rarely opened. I handed it to him without saying much, and he took it like it was something fragile, something special. Not because it was holy, but because it was personal. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he let it rest on his chest, both hands resting lightly on top, like he was letting it breathe before being disturbed. He didn't say anything for a long time. I thought he might have fallen asleep, but then he opened his eyes and looked at me with a quiet intensity. "Everyone reads the Bible for answers," he said, "but it was never meant to be an answer book. It's a mirror. You don't find God in it. You find yourself." The words made me freeze. I'd never heard it explained that way. For most of my life, the Bible had been something to memorize, to study, to quote, a tool to prove a point, to win an argument, to check a box. But a mirror, that was something different. That was scary in the best kind of way. He opened the book slowly, carefully, flipping not to the beginning or the end, but deep into the middle. His fingers moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times. But his expression was anything but routine. "There are verses," he said, "that we avoid, not because we don't understand them, but because we do. They're too honest, too close to home." He pointed to a passage in Lamentations. I remember it because I had never underlined that section, never spent time there. It was one of those books that seemed like a small note in the bigger story, overshadowed by Psalms, the Gospels, Paul's letters. But as he began to read, his voice low and shaky, I felt something shift in the room. He read, "He has walled me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail." He closed the book, but the silence that followed felt louder than the words themselves. "That," he said, "is the kind of faith I believe in. Not the kind that waits for miracles, but the kind that survives without them." I remember feeling completely shocked. I had always been taught that the Bible was meant to guide, uplift, promise. But here was a man loved by millions, holding on to words of despair, confusion, and silence. Words that didn't have an easy, happy ending. And yet somehow they brought him comfort because they told the truth. He opened the Bible again, this time flipping toward the Gospels. He paused in John, ran his fingers down a column until he stopped and tapped a single verse. He didn't read it aloud right away. Instead, he looked at me and said, "This one. This is the one I carry in my blood." Then he read, "Jesus wept." Just 2 words. That was it. A verse I'd seen 100 times, usually passed over or used to answer Bible trivia questions. But now, in that room, in that moment, it carried the weight of the whole world. He repeated it quieter this time, as if the words themselves needed space. Jesus wept, he whispered. Do you understand what that means? The Son of God didn't preach, didn't fix, didn't offer a lesson. He cried. He cried because his friend was dead. He cried because people were broken. He cried because he was human. His voice broke slightly as he continued. That's the God I believe in. Not just the one who rules, but the one who weeps. It was then that I realized I was holding my breath. I had never thought of the Bible like this. Not as a collection of rules or promises, but as a record of pain, a book of broken hearts, of human hurt, of God being present not by always saving the day, but by always staying. We sat there for a while longer, turning pages slowly, not reading so much as listening to the words, to the silence between us, to whatever was moving beneath the surface. I saw him pause again, this time in Isaiah, and read silently for a while before closing the Bible completely and resting his hand on the cover. If they ever carve a verse on my tombstone, he said, I hope it's this one. His voice was soft, but it rang with a finality that made my chest tight. I leaned in as he recited it. His words slow, careful. In quietness and trust shall be your strength. He didn't explain it. He didn't have to. The verse spoke of surrender, not fighting, of strength born not from noise or power, but from stillness, from trust, from a faith that doesn't need to shout. I wrote that verse down that night, not in a notebook, but on a small piece of paper I kept folded in my wallet. I took it out sometimes when the world felt too loud, when my hands felt too empty, when prayers felt like they were hitting the ceiling and bouncing back. It reminded me not just of him, but of how the special things often hide in the small places, the quiet verses, the overlooked pages. I used to think the Bible was meant to tell us what to do, but that day, I learned it could also just be with us. It could hold you, show you yourself, sit with you in your mess, and whisper, me too. That was the day the Bible stopped being just a book for me. It became a conversation, and I've never read it the same way since. It was later that week when he finally brought it up. Not with any big announcement, not with warning, just a sudden change in how he was talking, like a door opening somewhere behind the words. The morning had been quiet, nothing special. The rain from the day before had stopped, and the light coming into the room seemed more golden than usual, like it had been softened by something you couldn't see. I had just finished fixing the blanket around his shoulders when he said, almost like he was talking to himself, there's something I've never said out loud. Not to anyone. I stopped, hands frozen in place. Not sure if he meant to keep talking or if he was just thinking out loud. He didn't look at me at first. He stared out the window again, with that same expression I'd come to know. Part memory, part weight, and then, just barely louder than a whisper, he added, this can never leave this room. He turned to me not with worry but with a desperate need. Promise me. I nodded without hesitation. Not because of his title, but because of the look in his eyes. This wasn't about keeping secrets to protect his image or power. This was something else, something fragile and special, maybe even dangerous. You know, he began slowly, the church is one of the most powerful forces on this earth. It has shaped countries, carried empires, survived wars and scandals, and yet, he paused, sometimes I wonder if it remembers why it began at all. I said nothing. There was no safe response to something like that, and I knew he didn't need me to agree or disagree. He needed someone to witness. He continued, voice low and careful. We've wrapped God in gold and marble. We've buried him under ceremony. We've turned his name into a brand, his teachings into bullet points. And worst of all, we've made people believe they need us, the institution, to reach him. He shook his head slowly, a sad smile at the corners of his mouth. But the truth is, they don't. They never did. That hit me like a shock. Coming from anyone else, it might have sounded rebellious, maybe even wrong, but coming from him, a man who had spent his entire life inside the heart of the institution, it felt like freedom. There were times, he said, when I sat on the grandest stages of faith and felt further from God than I ever did alone in a chapel at night, surrounded by robes and ritual and respect, but empty inside. Because God doesn't live in cathedrals made of stone. He lives in hearts cracked open by love. And sometimes we forget that. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing out like a man letting go of something that had been stuck in his chest for decades. I've seen people turned away for not dressing the right way, for not knowing the prayers, for loving the wrong person, for asking too many questions. And every time it happened, we told ourselves we were protecting the faith. But what we were really doing was protecting control. His words weren't angry. They were sad. Not the rage of someone who wanted to burn everything down, but the grief of someone who had given everything to something, only to realize it wasn't always what it claimed to be. I still love the church, he said suddenly, as if afraid I'd misunderstood. It's been my life. My body is built of its rhythms. But loving something doesn't mean pretending it's perfect. Sometimes love means standing in the middle of it and saying, "This isn't who we're meant to be." The room felt tighter somehow, like the air had gotten thicker. It was hard to breathe, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of truth hanging between us. "You know what we never talk about?" he asked. "We never talk about fear, about how so much of what we do in the name of faith is driven by fear. Fear of change, fear of doubt, fear of people we don't understand. And yet the gospel, if you strip everything else away, is about fearlessness, about crazy, outrageous love, about tables that welcome everyone, not just the clean and the quiet." I was stunned, not just by what he said, but by how calmly, how gently he said it, like someone opening a door, not by kicking it down, but with a key he had been carrying in his heart for years. "And this is the truth no one wants to say out loud," he whispered, "that the Spirit moves where it wants, that no one, no bishop, no priest, no pope has a monopoly on God. He meets people in bedrooms, on buses, in bars, in prison cells, in alleys and apartments, and forests and fields. The divine isn't trapped. It never was." He turned his head and looked me in the eyes. "They think I've spent my life guiding people to God. But the truth is, most of the time, I've just been trying to keep the church from getting in the way." The silence after that was unbearable, not because it was empty, but because it was full, heavy with everything he'd said and everything I now had to carry. "I dream of a church," he said finally, "where people are free to ask questions without shame, where love isn't controlled and grace isn't limited, where we stop building walls and start building tables." He was tired by then. I could see it in the way his hands shook and how his breathing had slowed. But he looked peaceful too, as if saying all of it had loosened something in him. I helped fix his blanket again and was about to stand when he reached for my hand. His grip was weak but steady. "Never mistake the church for God," he said, eyes locked on mine. "One can fail you, the other never will." And then, almost without me noticing, he let go. I stood there long after his eyes had closed again, the weight of his words still keeping me in place. And though he had made me promise never to repeat them, those exact words, I knew that someday, somehow, they would find their way into the world, because some truths are too special to stay hidden. It happened late one evening when the hospital lights had dimmed, and most of the world seemed to be asleep. I had stayed longer than my shift, not because I had to, but because something in me knew I couldn't leave. His condition had been getting worse slowly, like the ocean pulling back from the shore bit by bit, and there was a heaviness in the air that night, a kind of spiritual weight I couldn't ignore. The machines were quiet, and he hadn't said much all day. But as I sat near him, half reading, half watching, he stirred, and his voice came out like a dam breaking, low, cracked, shaking. "Do you think the world is getting better?" he asked, staring not at me, but through the ceiling. Like the question wasn't meant for either of us, but for something far above. I hesitated. It wasn't the kind of question you answer quickly. Not here. Not now. He didn't wait for my response, which was good, because I didn't have one. "I've seen so much," he said. "More than any one person should. Sat in rooms where peace was discussed like a business deal. Walked among broken buildings where prayers were whispered over ashes instead of altars. Held the hands of children whose eyes had seen too much. And still the world turns as if nothing is wrong." His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the thin blanket over his chest, and his voice grew quieter. "They show me reports every day, numbers, headlines, pictures, but I don't need charts to know what's happening. You can feel it, can't you? The falling apart?" He paused. And for a moment, the only sound was the hum of the light above. "War isn't new," he said, "but we've made it normal. Unfairness isn't new, but we've made it acceptable. The suffering of the poor, the homeless, those without a voice. It doesn't shock us anymore. That's what scares me the most. Not the violence, but the not caring." Then something happened I had not expected. Something that made my breath catch in my chest. He began to cry. Not quietly, not with a single tear down his cheek, but fully, his body shaking slightly, the sobs raw and without warning. I moved closer by instinct, but he didn't reach for comfort. He just wept. "I saw a boy once," he said through tears, "in a refugee camp. He couldn't have been more than 6, covered in dust, barefoot, his eyes sunken. And he had this tiny red ball, just a scrap of rubber really, and he threw it up in the air and caught it, and smiled like he had everything he needed in that moment. No food, no home, no future, but a ball and joy." His voice broke again, and I couldn't do anything. I blessed him. I prayed over him, but I couldn't fix it. I couldn't fix any of it. I felt my own throat tighten. I had seen suffering too, but never through his eyes. Eyes that had seen horrible things hidden behind ceremony, pain hidden behind rules. This wasn't the sadness of a man upset by news stories. This was the grief of someone who had carried the pain of the world like a heavy cross pressed deep into his bones. "They bring me plans," he said, a little anger rising in his voice now. "Projects, budgets, partnerships. But they don't bring me compassion. They don't bring me tears. They've forgotten how to cry." He looked at me then, and I swear in that moment, he wasn't just speaking to me. He was speaking to everyone. "Do you know what the world has forgotten?" he asked, voice low but sharp as a knife. "Tenderness. We've become efficient, advanced, connected, but we've lost tenderness. The kind that stops for a stranger, that feeds someone without taking a video of it, that listens without trying to fix, that feels sad without needing permission." He laid his head back against the pillow, tired, but the intensity in his eyes stayed. "And if they don't return to this one thing, it's over." The words hit the air like a warning bell. Not screamed, not shouted, whispered, but more powerful than anything loud. I waited, my heart beating fast, wondering what he'd say next. The room felt like it was holding its breath. "The answer isn't in making more rules," he said with a tired voice. "It's in helping people see each other again. Really see each other." He closed his eyes for a moment, and I thought maybe he needed to rest. But then he looked at me again, his eyes full of something I can't really explain. "You know what most people are hungry for?" he asked. "Not food, not even money. They're hungry to be noticed, to matter to someone." I nodded, thinking of all my patients over the years, how what they often needed most wasn't medicine but someone to hold their hand. When you look someone in the eyes, really look, you're saying, "I see you. You exist. You matter. That's holy work," he whispered. "Maybe the holiest." His breathing changed a little, getting slower, and I checked the machines out of habit. Everything was stable, but I could tell he was getting tired. "I wish," he started, then stopped like the words were too big to get out. "What do you wish?" I asked quietly, the first time I'd really spoken in a while. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to see right through me. I wish I had done more of that. Less talking from balconies, more sitting in kitchens, less blessing crowds, more hearing stories. His voice got even softer. There's so much I didn't understand until it was almost too late. Then he surprised me by reaching for my hand. His skin felt paper thin but warm. "Do you know why I'm telling you all this?" he asked. I shook my head. Because nurses see people. Really see them. Not as problems to solve or souls to save, but as humans who hurt and hope and try their best. You know what people look like when they're scared, when they're brave, when they're hanging on by a thread. I felt tears coming to my eyes but tried to hold them back. "The world doesn't need more fancy words about God," he said. "It needs more people who notice what hurts, who sit with pain without running away, who touch wounds without disgust." He took a deep breath that seemed to cost him a lot. That's what Jesus did, you know. He didn't just talk about love. He touched lepers. He ate with outcasts. He washed dirty feet. The lights in the hallway dimmed even more, and his room got darker except for the soft glow from the machines. It made his face look almost holy, like in a painting. "I'm afraid," he admitted suddenly, and it shocked me because it seemed so human, so real. "Of dying?" I asked gently. He shook his head slowly. "No. Of what happens to the message when I'm gone. I'm afraid they'll keep the golden cross but forget the dirty stable. They'll remember the rules but forget the meals with sinners." He squeezed my hand a little tighter. "Promise me something else," he said. "Anything," I answered, and I meant it. "When you leave this room, when you go back to your life, remember what matters. Not who's right, but who's hurting. Not who deserves help, but who needs it. Not what's allowed, but what's kind." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink into me. "And tell others," he added, "not with big speeches, just by how you live, by who you stop for, by what you notice, by whose hand you hold." We sat in silence for a long time after that. I didn't need to say anything, and neither did he. The air between us felt thick with something important, something I'd carry with me forever. Eventually, his eyes closed, and he drifted off to sleep. I stayed a little longer, watching his chest rise and fall, thinking about everything he'd shared. As I finally got up to leave, I realized something had changed in me. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in that quiet way that important changes often happen. Like a door had opened inside me that I didn't even know was there. I still think about him often. About those days in that simple room where a dying man shared his heart with a nurse. I think about faith differently now. About church. About God. About what it means to really see people. I never told anyone exactly what he said. I kept that promise. But I've tried to live it. To notice the hurting. To sit with the lonely. To touch wounds without looking away. And sometimes, when the world feels too broken, or when my own faith feels shaky, I whisper his prayer. The one he said when no one else was listening. The one that admits doubt but chooses to stay anyway. Because maybe that's what real faith is after all. Not having all the answers. Not being certain. But being willing to keep your heart open when everything tells you to close it. To keep loving when it would be easier not to. To keep showing up, even in the dark. And if there's one thing I learned from those quiet conversations, it's that sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer each other isn't wisdom or answers or even prayer. Sometimes, the most powerful thing is just being there, really there, with eyes that truly see, and a heart that's not afraid to break a little for someone else. That's what he taught me, and that's what I'm trying to live.